I'm talking here, if you go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 2, just to give you a little bit of time to look that up. I've been doing some study in the book of Daniel, and the Lord's really encouraged my heart and taught me a lot of things about it. I'm in the section of Daniel right now that's kind of keeping me there stalled for a while, doing a lot of studies in the last part of Daniel. But in the first few chapters of Daniel, we're going to be in Daniel 2 and starting in verse 27 in just a minute here. But I want us to notice for just a minute how God was working in the book of Daniel, how God was working in the life of King Nebuchadnezzar. It's interesting because we have three primary stories that we see that are very familiar stories, and basically how God was teaching Nebuchadnezzar and helping him to understand more of himself. And I was doing kind of a comparison and a study, noticing how what God put into his life, and then how he responded to God, and then did that change his heart? Like, was that a lasting change, or was that just something that was some nice words? And it was interesting how in the first two instances, we see a situation where a lot of what the response he had seemed good, but when you look at what happened just after that, you realize there was no lasting change in his life. And I want us to just kind of look at that. I know that we're looking at an unsaved heathen king here. I do believe God was trying to show Nebuchadnezzar more of himself and bring him closer to him and to be able to understand more about who God was, and then actually to have a right relationship with God. So I've got a lot of places we're going to be turning, but I don't want to be reading the whole story. This is familiar territory here. So if you could go ahead and start reading with me verse 27 of Daniel 2. I hope this can be a blessing to you this evening. Before I start reading verse 27 there, that was the text to read, but the background here is, of course, the dream that God had given. And remember that he couldn't understand, or he didn't even know what the dream was, let alone the interpretation. And then Daniel comes in and was able to give the dream and the interpretation. So this is at the end of that. This is at this, I'm getting my timing confused, but let's read, verse 27. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these." Okay, so that was at the start. Sorry for getting that order confused there. This was what God was wanting to show him. God was wanting to do a miracle and show him not only what the dream was, so God gave the dream in the first place, then now God's going to give it to him again because he forgot, and then he's going to interpret the dream and tell him what the meaning of it was. And I don't know about you, but there have been different times when I've just kind of wished, that the Lord would give things out plainly, speak to us in a little bit more straightforward of a way like we have here with King Nebuchadnezzar. But it's interesting as you see his response and actually his stubbornness in allowing himself to be changed. Kind of getting ahead of myself here. So what was God doing to show to Nebuchadnezzar? God was saying, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to show you a little bit of the future. I'm going to show you some things that are going to be happening. In that, he talks about King Nebuchadnezzar and the kingdom of Babylon being as the head of gold. And once again, I'm not going to go into that whole story and the meaning of it because that's not the purpose of the study here. But God was showing that he, as God, had all wisdom and knowledge. He could show things that were secret. He could show beyond the shadow of a doubt all the things that even his wise men could not understand. So God's showing his wisdom and knowledge. So that's kind of the big picture, I think, of what God is showing him. Down in 47 now, verse 47, this is after everything's done, after God showed the meaning of the dream through Daniel. His response now. So verse 47, the king answered unto Daniel and said, "Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal the secret." Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. So look at his response here. He's seeing some things. His understanding of God is becoming clearer. But you notice mainly what he's doing here is he's thanking Daniel for sharing this. And he did recognize here, it says, your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets. So he was thankful. He's seeing a little bit more of God. But you don't see him denouncing any of his false gods. You don't see any humility in him. Mainly what you see is God gave him a blessing, and he's being thankful and grateful for the blessing, which is a good thing, okay? There's nothing wrong with being grateful and thankful. But it's interesting, as I was studying, you read this, we come almost to the end of the chapter, and then it's starting in verse 1 of chapter 3, then we see now Nebuchadnezzar is erecting this statue of gold and commanding everybody to worship it. And it almost seems like the statue of gold, there's no clear indication, but it almost seems that perhaps it was something similar to what he had seen in his dream, except now he's making the entire statue out of gold, not just the head. In his dream, he had the head of gold, and I don't have any way of proving that the statue looked the same, but it is kind of coincidental that we have an image of a man in his dream, head of gold, and now you see an entire image of gold that he's standing up and telling everybody to worship it. Application to us from this first little section. God showed his wisdom and his knowledge. He did a miracle. His response, the king's response, was that of thankfulness. But that thankfulness didn't change his heart to where his lifestyle was different. He didn't see God differently in his everyday life. He went right back to worshiping and commanding people to worship a false God. And I was thinking about sometimes when we see God do something for us, once again, it is good to be thankful. But thankfulness is only the start. Even an unsaved person can see God do something amazing, be thankful for them, and it's not long before they forget all about it. You know, you see somebody that was in an accident and God saved their life, or some miraculous thing happened, and they will even be able to recognize and say, yes, God did that for me. And yet, you look at their life just weeks or months or at least, a year or two later, and nothing's changed about their life. And I wonder, maybe in our own Christian lives too, sometimes we think that thankfulness is a substitute for a closer relationship with God and seeing God truly for who he is. Now, once again, I think that is part of it. It definitely can be connected, so don't understand in this that I'm trying to downplay the importance of thankfulness. But thankfulness in and of itself is not a replacement for a walk with God and understanding God and his character and who he is. Because once again, a heathen king was thankful. Unsaved people, you know, they can be thankful about what God did, but does that really change their life? Look down now at the next section here, and once again, I'm not going to read all of chapter 3. We know the story here. He set up the statue. He commanded everybody to bow down to it. Then Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego refused to bow. He called them before him. Let's jump down in the story to verse 27. So chapter 3, verse 27. So remember, he threw them into the fire and had them bound, but then he sees them walking around in the midst of the fire with their hands and feet no longer bound, and he saw a fourth, like the Son of God, walking with them in the fire. Once again, so many lessons through that. But in verse 27, this is Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 27, and the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. 28 as well. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel, and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, that every people, nation, and language, which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Okay, so in the first example of the dream, God was specifically showing his wisdom and his knowledge to show that which could not be known by anybody else. Now we're seeing God showing his absolute power. His power over the fire, his power to let some things in the fire burn, as in the rope was burned off their hands, but their clothes didn't even have the smell upon them. And not only that, there's so many miracles in here, even the miracle of God giving his servants enough faith to be able to go into that fire, and then them also being able to see, the king being able to see the Son of God walking in the midst of the fire. That amazing display of power. Once again, that's not something that even people in that time, but definitely not in our time today, we don't see that kind of thing happening. We would love to be able to see perhaps sometimes these great miraculous displays, which God, even in the history of, even throughout the Bible, there are only certain times when God chose to show his power in this way. And yet now King Nebuchadnezzar, an unsaved king, gets to see this. So he's able to see God's absolute power. What was his response, though? We just read it. He was praising God, but here he went a little bit further than he had the previous time. Now he's commanding that if anybody speak anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they would be killed, their houses be made into a trash heap, because there is no God that can deliver after this sort. So he is praising the Lord. He is praising and thankful. Notice, though, there's nothing in there that says he himself was worshiping God. He's simply telling everybody else, don't say anything against him, which is interesting, of course, having just seen moments earlier when he was the one casting them into the fire because they refused to worship his own God, and he was the one talking against their God. But now he's saying, everybody else, if you say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you're going to be destroyed. Application to us here. Obviously, we've just seen in the first example, praise to God is an incredibly important thing. It can be connected with worship. Praise in and of itself can be separated from worship and could be something all by itself that is not worship. Once again here, we see him praising, but then he's commanding other people to do it. He's even trying to get other people involved, and it makes me wonder whether perhaps there was kind of a substitute where he was commanding other people to do it because he himself didn't want to. He was recognizing it as that God had power. We don't know his motive. What we do know is his actions, that he was commanding everybody else without any sign of himself bowing before God and worshiping before the Lord. He had no humility here. He was recognizing that God had power, but there's no apology in here. No direct prayer to God. He wasn't talking to God here. He was simply saying, okay, I'm willing to recognize God has power. God has amazing power even to be able to deliver after this sort. So the first two instances here that we're seeing are miracles, amazing displays, first of all, of God's wisdom and knowledge, then of God's absolute power. So you're seeing two amazing miracles, but in those, the king's heart still hadn't been softened, and you see that as you get into chapter 4. The king was still a very prideful man, one who did not want to recognize God as the source of his own success. He didn't want to recognize God as his king. So once again, maybe you see some progress here, but he's still not at the point of worshiping God. And I wonder sometimes if we can do things that sometimes can be worshipful. They can be connected to worship, certainly encouraging somebody else to be worshiping God or to not say anything against the God of the Bible. Certainly that can be a good thing. But in and of itself, that is not a replacement for real worship. So those first two instances, then we come into chapter 4. So I told you we're hopping around here, but coming with a thought and a theme here. In chapter 4 here, God is going to give another dream, another vision specifically to show the king this time something that was going to be happening in his future. So come down to verse 30 verse 30. Okay, I'm going to skip the whole reading of the dream I just didn't want to have too long of passages to read here. But remember, in the dream, God basically said, if you continue in your pride, this is what is going to happen to you. If you continue in your pride, you're going to become a madman. I need you to see that I am the only one who is God, and I am the one that is giving the power. And God wanted him to know, I believe, where this thing was coming from. And God could have chosen to just allow the madness to come upon him, but then perhaps King Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have understood what is the purpose, what is the reason for this, this is God doing it. This isn't just some illness that came upon him. So God told him, first of all, this is going to be happening. And then, actually, I'm not going to read it, but in verse 27, Daniel is then pleading with the king to change his ways, to recognize his own position before God. It talks about him breaking off his sins and the idea of changing himself and recognizing that he's sinful and he needs to be submitting to God. But God knew that he was going to be stubborn. Let's go ahead now to verse 30, where I mentioned just a minute ago. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power, and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. And they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. Okay, so again, let's look at what God was showing him. God explained ahead of time so there could be no mistake who this came from. And then he showed him an illustration and said, I am in charge of everything. I am absolutely sovereign. Your kingdom did not come by your own abilities and wisdom and power. Your kingdom came through me. I can do what I want. You refuse to acknowledge me as king, I will take away the position that I've given you. Once again, you've got a heathen king here. And yet God had allowed him to be in that position. God was using him, but God chose, for some reason, to single out Nebuchadnezzar out of all the kings, perhaps because of his association with Daniel and because his story would then be able to be given to us today. For whatever reason, God singled Nebuchadnezzar out and said, I am going to prove to you and to all the world that I am king over everything. I am sovereign above all. So now, God gave the dream. Then it came to pass. So now King Nebuchadnezzar is out as a madman, living among the wild animals, out of his senses, but obviously enough of his mind was there for him to still be able to understand the lesson that God was teaching. And I don't understand exactly how that is, but God can do what he wants. God chose to allow some aspects of the king to be enough of a lunatic that they kicked him out of the palace, and to where he's out there and he's not even caring about trimming his nails, or he's eating the grass like the oxen. He's doing a lot of things that you would think of a complete lunatic, and yet there are some things about his reasoning that you see, especially near the end anyway, where it tells us how his understanding came. So perhaps he was completely insane up to a certain point, or perhaps God was teaching him or helping to convince his mind, change his mind through that time. But we know that near the end of the days, we're going to go ahead and read in 34 now. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven. Mine understanding returned unto me. So obviously now his understanding, as far as his wisdom and everything, it's all coming back to him. His understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand and say unto him, What doest thou? You notice what God did here in this third illustration or third section of Nebuchadnezzar's life. God showed his power and sovereignty, but this wasn't something more, spectacular that Nebuchadnezzar could sit from a distance and watch it happening, as he did when he was seeing the dream revealed to him. That was something he was just watching unfold before his eyes. And then as he had thrown the men into the fiery furnace, this was something, again, where he could watch it unfolding. He could see the miracle happening before his eyes. Now the thing is happening to him. Now God is choosing to give him a trial, a punishment. And almost as if he was saying, if you won't learn from this, and you won't learn from this, you won't humble yourself, okay, well, here's what I'm going to have to do. And now, finally, after 7 years of living as a madman, finally he's willing to recognize God alone is king. I love the phrasing and just the majestic terminology used to refer to God, and just the end of verse 34, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And then at 35, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. So he's including himself now. Not just some of you people out there. He's realizing, I am of no power before God. Compared to God, I am nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none. And that once again, he's seeing himself now. None can stay his hand and say unto him, What doest thou? It's interesting now how we don't have anything more in the life of King Nebuchadnezzar, but it certainly appears that his heart was truly changed. It's hard to tell from what is listed in the scriptures here whether this was truly full enough understanding of God that he actually is in heaven today. It certainly, by looking at what his statement is here, it certainly would be possible. But certainly God saw enough of a change of his heart that then in verse 36, it says, At the same time my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my Lord sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. And then look at that last 37 there, the last statement about him in this chapter. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment. And those that walk in pride, he is able to abase. Certainly he was a living example of somebody who God was able to abase. As I was studying through this, several things that came to my mind as far as challenges to us. First of all, that Nebuchadnezzar learned more, it seems, about genuine worship before God in the trial than he did in the 2 previous spectacular miracles. And obviously, it is amazing and wonderful when God does miracles where we're seeing blessings in our life. But I at least can say in my own life, unfortunately, it seems like those times of trial sometimes are needed to get my attention. When the blessings, we can be thankful for them, and we can even say, Lord, thank you, but it doesn't make us bow before God in humility and worship, unfortunately, many times, like being brought to our knees in a trial. And the challenge to me in this was that if I could see God and worship God in a more full and humble way when God's doing the amazing miracles, or even the little, not so amazing to some people, types of blessings. If I can be humble before God and worship God truly in those situations, maybe I wouldn't have to come to the point of God doing something more major as a trial in my life. But certainly when God chooses to put something into our life that is a trial, certainly we can thank the Lord for it, because look at the blessing that it brought in Nebuchadnezzar's life. Yeah, it took him 7 years, 7 years of him being a madman, but then it brought him to a right relationship with God, at least as far as recognizing God truly for who he is. When we're looking at the sovereignty of God, as even Nebuchadnezzar was able to see, just some challenging thoughts here. Do we see the hurtful actions, the trials, the sins done against us? Do we recognize those? Yes, as sin, if somebody sinned against us, but do we recognize them as being allowed by the sovereignty of God, and that truly God does have a purpose? We like to see, well, that's a sin, and that's horrible and terrible, and well, of course, God is not the author of sin. I understand that, but sometimes I think in our effort to, I'm trying to word this in the right way. Let me just back up and say, God is in control of everything. God could have stopped that from happening, but God allows evil things to happen to me and to you, and he has a purpose. That doesn't mean just because God has a purpose in allowing somebody to wrong me, it doesn't mean that somehow that person has no guilt before God. We can prove that many times throughout the Bible, but God is sovereign. How about our successes? That's what King Nebuchadnezzar was struggling with. His successes, he was trying to just heap those as praise upon himself, and he was being all thankful for all of his successes and how he had built up this country, and yet God was wanting him to see, no, that is not you. Yes, I allowed it, but that wasn't you, that was me. And how many times, we've heard these stories before, but how many times do we look at our successes, and maybe in our words, maybe we would say to somebody else, well, thank the Lord for allowing it to happen. But in our heart, we get kind of prideful because, hey, I did this and I did that and this, I've made all these things happen. And I wonder how many times God looks at us and we have a very similar attitude to what Nebuchadnezzar had. And we're not recognizing God as being truly the sovereign ruler of our lives. Coming to the end of this, the final conclusion as I was studying through this, and I hope that your mind and heart can be directed this way as we finish up. God was trying to show Nebuchadnezzar all along, I have all wisdom and knowledge, yes. I have all power to do anything I want. But the biggest thing is God was wanting to show him, I'm sovereign. I am everything. You are nothing. And he wanted him to just be willing to submit himself and work under the hand of God. And you notice God's desire wasn't to just completely take away his kingdom. As soon as his mindset changed, God gave it back plus more. And yet God wanted him to be in the right worshipful heart before God as the King of Kings. So I challenge you, I don't know what particular aspect of this the Lord spoke to you about, but I challenge you to look at your own life and just evaluate according to some of the lessons that God was trying to teach Nebuchadnezzar. And I wonder what God wants to show you about the way that we see him. And perhaps we're responding sometimes in thankfulness. Sometimes we're even encouraging other people to be thankful. And once again, we need to continue doing that. But we need to never let that be a substitute for genuine, humble worship before the sovereign King of the universe. Let's go ahead and pray. Thanks, Lord, for your goodness to us, and thank you for the illustration we have of Nebuchadnezzar and through his life, all that you taught him. Thank you that you can teach us through that as well. I do ask that you would keep on working in our lives and keep on helping us to recognize ourselves before you as who we really are, and more importantly, who you are to us, and to truly worship before you. Thank you, God, for your goodness. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thank you very much.